For those of you that don't know me, I'm actually an Android developer. That's my day job. I literally write and work on Android apps every single day. And yet, as of filming this video, I haven't done an Android development-based video on this channel. Today, however, I finally want to change that. In this video, I want to show and explain to you what an Android project codebase looks like. What's the project structure? What are some of the important files and folders? And what do some of the important files do? And how does it all tie together? If you've ever had an Android codebase thrust in front of you and you've not been entirely sure what exactly you're looking at, then this is the video for you. Let's do this. Hi folks, my name is Ben and welcome back to the channel. If you haven't already, consider hitting that subscribe button if you enjoy what I do here. And of course, don't forget to leave a thumbs up if you like this video. Really quickly, before I start, I just want to say, although this is my first Android development video for this channel, I plan on making a bunch more. However, in the meantime, if you are hungry for some more juicy Android dev content in the form of videos, then I'd like to recommend you two incredible YouTube channels that I personally am a massive fan of both, and I've used both of these channels in my professional Android development. The two channels I would recommend that you check out are Coding with Mitch and Coding in Flow. There'll be links in the description to both. Right, Android developers mostly, unless they're complete masochists, use a tool called Android Studio to develop their apps. It is an incredibly massive, awesome piece of software that has a bunch of functionality. It handles a bunch of heavy lifting for you, including setting up the initial Android project codebase. And of course, it provides you with a huge array of tools to help you build the best app that you can, and of course, to diagnose problems with your app. We're not going to talk deeper today about Android Studio in this video. However, we are going to use it to set up a blank project so I can show you all the files and folders and explain what they each do. Quick important note, any links that I mention throughout the entirety of this video you can find in the description down below. So let's jump over to my screen so that you can see me setting up this Android project. I'm going to open Android Studio, the application, and I'm just going to run through the process really quickly of setting up a blank project. So on the initial screen, I'm going to select New Android Project. I'm just going to click Empty Activity and hit Next. I'm not going to change any of the default. I just want to set up a blank project. I'm going to hit Finish and we're done. So we've done absolutely nothing other than set up that blank project, and we're now inside of Android Studio looking at one of the files of the project. If you want to learn more about Android Studio in future videos, like how to use it, how to navigate it, how to make apps with it, then please leave me a comment down below to let me know. For now, I'd like to bring your attention to this side of the screen, over here on the left. This is mostly where we'll be looking in this video. This panel over here is our project panel and shows us some of the files and folders that make up our project. However, one thing I want to point out really quickly to start with is that Android Studio gives you a couple of different modes of using this project panel. And it's currently got the Android mode selected. The Android mode doesn't actually give you a true visualization of all of the files and folders that make up your project. The Android view that is selected here by default actually abstracts away some of the files and some of the duplicated files and some of the folders to give you apparently an easier view of the Android project as a whole. However, as I said, this is not a true representation of the file tree, and I personally don't like this view. I like to know exactly what is going on with all of my files and folders, exactly what is in my project. So if you click on the drop-down arrow and select Project, okay, out of all of these options, this now will give you a true representation of the file tree as you'd see it in a file explorer or in Finder. Okay, so in a blank Android project, you'll have this first folder, which in my case is called My Application 2, which is the application that you've just set up in Android Studio. You'll have this external libraries and scratches and consoles areas as well that we'll come back and talk about in just a second. For now, let's dive into our application structure. And I'm just going to go through each of these and explain what on earth they are and what they do. So in order, this first one, this .gradle folder. You'll hear and see the word Gradle throughout most Android projects. So the aim of an Android project, of course, is to build this one thing, this one app that can be installed on phones and run by users, right? However, Android projects are made up of hundreds, maybe thousands of different files and folders and images and media and code. And somehow all of those different files and folders need to be brought together from all over the place to turn into this one thing that is deployable, runnable. this one app. To do that, we need something called a build system. They're basically software that help you turn all of the crazy files into your one thing, your one project, your one thing that you're trying to make. And in the Android world, we have a build system called Gradle. So throughout the codebase, you're going to see all sorts of references to Gradle. This .gradle folder is a project-specific cache directory, which is automatically generated by Gradle itself. Basically, it keeps your Gradle versions cached for this project. A developer should never ever need to touch that folder, and something that we're going to cover later in this video, this folder should be added to your gitignore file. We'll talk about that again later. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Next is this .idea folder. Really quickly and simply, this folder stores all sorts of information and settings about your IDE, your configured IDE, your Android Studio. And again, a developer should never need to touch the insides of this folder. This app folder is the important one, if you hadn't already guessed. This app folder is actually called a module in the Android world. An app can be made up of one or many modules. And a module is simply a collection of source files, resources, and build settings that sort of split your app into discrete functionality chunks, if you like. If that got confusing to you, then don't worry. Just know that this app folder is where all of the code is for your app. In the Android world, there are several different kinds of modules that you can create. I won't cover those in this video, but this module, this app module, which is a default by the way when you create a blank project, is an Android app module, which hopefully, obviously, lets you create an app for phones or tablets or cars or watches or TVs or whatever Android runs on. So importantly, we're going to be coming back to this folder to look deeper into that folder in just a bit. Next is this just Gradle folder. Not the .gradle folder, which we looked at earlier, just the Gradle folder. I know, it can get a bit confusing. So this folder actually simply just stores our Gradle wrapper. The Gradle wrapper is actually another incredibly important thing that we're going to cover in just a little bit. This folder just contains the actual wrapper jar file, the sort of the executable wrapper, and properties for it. Again, after initial setup, a developer should rarely need to touch the contents of this folder, and this should be included in your version control system. So this folder shouldn't be on your gitignore file. Again, we'll talk about that just in a bit. So next on the list is our first file, and this is called .gitignore. We've talked about this file previously in the video, so we need a little bit more context to understand this file. Developers use systems called version control systems, which basically, short version, track changes to files over time so that if there's a mistake, we can revert backwards to older versions in time. Git is one of these version control systems. In fact, on the Git front, if you'd like to learn more about Git and version control systems in general, then I actually have a video series on my channel about exactly that. There'll be a pop-up link here to that video series, or of course, links in the description below. So back to the file. In fact, let's just open it up and see the contents of it. Remember, Git tracks changes to files over time. The gitignore file really simply just tells Git, hey, ignore these files. Please don't track them. Ignore them, they're not important. Don't store changes to them over time. Don't know about them, don't listen to them, don't do anything with them. A developer will of course need to edit and change this file. And in fact, just to call back to what we were talking about later, the very first folder we talked about, the .gradle file, is included in this list. So it isn't tracked, it's ignored from Git. And in fact, as you can see here, certain parts of the .idea folder, of course, as well, are ignored. On to the next one, this build.gradle file. Quickly, I'll point out that a project might actually contain more than one build.gradle file. It's just it might be in a subdirectory, or it might be like this one in the top level directory of our folder. So we'll talk about the other one in a second. For now, we'll talk about this top level, project level build.gradle. A build.gradle file, of course, is to do with Gradle, and it contains configurations and tasks and important information for Gradle in order to carry out your actual builds. Do you remember that sort of bringing together of all of the files? This top level, project level build.gradle file contains configuration options common to all subprojects and modules. Basically, long story short, all of the modules that we covered previously, module folders, inherit these build configurations. You can, of course, that we'll talk about in just a second, have build configurations specific to that module. which is those build.gradle files within the module files themselves. We'll talk about that in a second. For now, what you need to know about this top level build.gradle is that it contains common configurations for all modules. Basically, all modules, all submodules are affected by this build.gradle. A developer will need to edit this file, and of course it will be tracked by your version control system. Next, we have this gradle.properties file, again, Gradle based. The Gradle process that actually builds your app, brings all the bits together, is actually a Java process. It runs on the JVM. And of course, the properties of that JVM process can be configured, and this is the file that does it. So let's just click in it. This file lets you mess around with all sorts of configurations for it. For example, like caching, memory allowance, Android X stuff, and much, much more. A developer might need to change this file, and of course, this should be tracked in your version control system. Next, we have the all-important gradlew file. This is a script, okay, that actually triggers if I just look for the word wrapper, you can see here, it actually triggers the Gradle wrapper that we were talking about earlier. The gradlew file is how all Gradle tasks should be run, okay? A Gradle task is a very sort of small chunk of the build process. So for example, build my app, for example, clean out all the folders. Those are Gradle tasks. You can of course set them up yourself, and any Gradle task should be run using the gradlew file. Specifically what it does, it invokes a specific version of Gradle. It automatically downloads it and runs your task using that version of Gradle, so that you as a developer don't have to go and download a specific version of Gradle that builds your app correctly. You don't have to do any of that manually. Use the gradlew script and it will do it automatically for you. This is an incredibly important file, and likelihood is that as a developer you will never need to change the contents of this file. However, it should be included in your source control. The gradlew.bat is essentially the Windows runnable version of the gradlew script. This does exactly the same thing as the gradlew, just is runnable on Windows machines in case you're developing on a Windows machine. Next is the local.properties file. This is where you configure local environment properties for your build system. For example, here, the only line that isn't a comment is telling the build system, telling Android Studio, telling Gradle where my Android SDK is located on my machine. 99% of the times, a developer will not need to change this file. And if I just show you the gitignore, you can see that file is ignored by our version control system. Next, although it doesn't look it, this settings.gradle file is incredibly important. It tells Gradle which modules should be included in your build, okay? So here, we have include app with a colon in front of. App, of course, is our app module, our Android app module. And it's saying, hey, make sure you include that module in our build process. If you had a multi-module app, so if there wasn't just app, if there was like, tracking or, network modules as well in the folder, then you would need to include each of those inside of the settings.gradle file. Next, I do want to talk about these two bottom things here. This external libraries thing, first of all. It's not a folder. If I just show you the folder structure, you can't see that external libraries folder here as an actual folder. Instead, what this place is a place for Android Studio to collect all of the dependencies of your app, all of the things that your app relies on, pieces of code, the Android SDK, for example, into a nice sort of visual area so that you can, if you wanted to, click into it and see the code for those things. So for example, my app relies on something called constraint layout, okay? If I just go into this here, I can look at the code for constraint layout. If it just loads up on the side here, I can actually look at the code. Again, this isn't something I've written. This is the dependency that my app relies on. And this external libraries area is just a place to collect all of those dependencies in case you need to look into them. And finally, this scratches and consoles bit, these are actually really cool and I've just learned about them myself. Again, this scratches and consoles area isn't a folder in my project structure. Instead, this is something that you can use across all of your different Android Studio projects. All your different apps that you're working on, maybe in different times or whatever, these scratches and consoles follow with you. So the scratches contain scratch files, and these are basically areas for you to jot down things. You can make new scratch files by right-clicking on scratches and consoles, a new scratch file, and then it can be of all sorts of any types. These files won't affect your actual code or your project or your build. These are just things for you basically to store notes in whatever form you see fit, maybe snippets of code as well, across your Android Studio projects. So here, for example, I just have a text file that says this is a scratch. And lastly, the consoles bit is a bit strange and interesting. Consoles in IntelliJ's world, in Android Studio world, are IDE scripting consoles. So integrated development environment, which is what Android Studio is. It's a place where you can write code. Scripting console. So you can write simple scripts that automate certain IntelliJ IDEA features. So automate certain Android Studio features. I'm probably going to make another video about this because this is a really interesting thing and I don't want to cover it too deeply here. Cool, so let's dive into the app module folder to learn more about that folder and what it contains. So remember, your module folder is basically a place to collect all of your source files and all of your resource files that sort of collect together to make this chunk of functionality. 90% of the times, and obviously when you create a fresh project in Android Studio, you'll just get the one app module which contains all of your app code and resources. The libs file, which you can see here, is currently empty. You can add in private dependencies into there if you wanted to, so you could stick in jar files into that folder. Next is the all-important src folder, which is short for source, like source code. And this folder is where all of your source code, all of the code for the app and all of its resources live inside of. So if I just show you very quickly, it contains 3 folders and deeper and deeper and deeper. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. That's the really important folder. Next, you actually have another .gitignore file for the module level and below. You don't actually need 2 or you don't need more than 1 gitignore file. It's just that having one at this subdirectory, at this level of the structure, lets you relative path ignore certain things. So this build that's automatically included in it is a folder that would exist in this app module level and not the higher level up. Next is the all-important module level, so app level and module level build.gradle. Remember, we talked about the project specific one earlier. This is the one that is for this app module. All modules will have a module level build.gradle so that the build system knows what it's doing when it comes to that module. And the things inside of this module level build.gradle file only affect this module, this app module. So if I had another module next to the app one called tracking or whatever, this build.gradle file that we can see here would not affect that one. In the Android world, your app level, so your application module level build.gradle file is really important. And this is where you include dependencies that Gradle should go and download and build into your application. It's also the place where you configure how the app is built and what it should do and which versions of Android operating system it should run on and what the version code is and so on. This file is incredibly important. A developer will 100% need to edit this file and it should be stored in your version control system. Finally, we have this proguard-rules.pro file. This is a really strange file, and in fact, as default, it all comes commented out, so there's nothing really in it. But this file is for a system called proguard, which is an incredibly important piece of software. It makes sure that your code is obfuscated, minified, shrunk, whatever it is before it is sort of turned into that one sort of runnable, deployable app. And on the ProGuard website, it boasts that it makes Java and Kotlin applications up to 90% smaller and 20% faster. This ProGuard's rule file here is a place that you can add your own ProGuard rules to tell ProGuard, of course, how it should deal with certain files. Cool, so that's all the files and folders that come as default inside of the app module. What I'm really quickly going to do now is actually build the app, just without changing any of the code, just build the app using Gradle and show you another folder that appears in this area. So I'm really quickly going to open up a terminal inside of Android Studio so that I can fire Gradle W commands. So I'm inside of my project right now inside of this terminal, and all I'm going to do is do Gradle W. Remember, we should use Gradle through the Gradle wrapper. And all I'm going to do is the command assemble debug, okay? And I'm going to hit go on that. Once that's running, let me just explain. The assemble debug Gradle task is essentially the task that says, hey, please build my app, build a version of my app. And particularly we're asking for the debug, the developer build of the app. So that's just finished, and you can see now back in our app module, we now have this build folder, which is the one that I was wanting to show you. The build folder is not something that you as a developer need to change, but is something that contains results or outputs of the build that you've just done, okay? So for example, the build outputs APK folder will contain your built APK. So that thing, that deployable app is also known as an APK. And you can see inside of the debug folder, we have an app debug APK. That is my built Android app, ready to be deployed on phones or installed. Okay, so let's have a look in the SRC folder, in the source folder. Immediately there are 3 folders. Let me just explain those quickly. The main folder is where all of your source code, your logic, your resources, all of your code lives inside of there, like to actually make the app, the runnable app. Again, we're going to look at that deeper in just a second. The test folder here is a place that you can write your unit test code. So in the developer world, we actually write code that tests our other code. So this test code, the code that we're going to write deeper down in this folder might test code from our main folder. And in fact, being a developer now, this is a necessity to write good automated test code. If you're interested in learning more about testing and what that thing is that we write code that tests other code, I've actually done a video on that I'll link to here. Finally, the last folder in this group is the AndroidTest folder. This is where we write, again, tests. So we're writing code that tests our other code, but this is specifically instrumentation test code. To boil it down, the code that we write inside of this Android test folder tests our user interface, you know, our screens popping up, our button clicks and all that kind of stuff. And the test that we write down in the test folder just tests our logic. It doesn't need a UI. It just goes, hey, does this add function add numbers? Hey, does this other function do this other thing? Finally, let's boil down into this main folder. Inside of this main folder are 3 important bits. 1, this Java folder. This is where we store all of our application's code. So the Kotlin or the Java code that we write to make our application do what it should do. That exists inside and below this Java folder. Next is the res folder, and this stands for resources. And in this folder is a bunch of other folders, and this is where we store our image files, our XML files, our layout files to lay out our app screens, and like our colors that we define in the app, our UI strings that we define in the app. All of these resources are in the res folder. And finally, the last thing that I'm going to cover in this video is the AndroidManifest.xml. This is one of the most important files in the entire Android project. This is a file that works as a bridge between the Android developer and the actual Android system. This file lets the developer define to the Android system what this app is going to do, what it contains, what permissions it should have. So for example, this default one that is auto-generated here, we have this application being defined. We're saying, hey, Android, here's an application I'm creating that has this name, this my application name, and that application contains this activity. Really quickly in the Android world, activity is basically just like a full screen, a full user interface screen. So we're saying, hey, Android, here's this application I'm defining, and that application has this one screen that it can do. If I wanted to have more screens available in my app, I would add more activities down in this file. This file is incredibly important because it lets us as developers tell Android what this app is going to do. And that is the last thing that I want to show you from the Android project codebase structure. There is so much more to learn about each of these things that I've already covered. I just gave you a really brief, quick overview of them so you can sort of understand them at a glance. And so that if you ever have an Android project just thrown in front of you, you can at least understand how to navigate it and what some of the important files are that you maybe need to look at. And of course, if this video has inspired you to learn more, then there are links in the description down below to everything that I've covered. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Apologies if this video turned out to be really long. I think it's just important to make sure to understand each of the bits that you see it and not skip over anything. If you've enjoyed this video and you actually want more Android development content, then don't fear, because I'm planning on doing a bunch of that in the future. However, if there's something specific that you'd like to know about, please reach out to me at my Twitter handle, @ben_gradle, or leave a comment down below. I do look at them. Don't forget, of course, to subscribe to this channel and click that bell icon if you want to be notified about when I release new videos. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. God, I haven't done this in ages. I'm so hot and sweaty. I kind of want to open up a window. I might open up a window. Sack it. Just Android. I'm always burping. But let's start from the top because I'm not super happy with that. Let's do the intro again. Cool. Cool. Great. Cool. Across, you can use scratches. You can use this scratches and consoles area